Good evening. My name is Jason Halub. I'm a first-year PhD student at Georgetown University studying history, and I'm here with Professor Aviel Roshwald to talk about his book, The Endurance of Nationalism. Now, Professor Roshwald, I understand you got your PhD from Harvard University, and you've authored three major monographs that largely focus on comparative nationalism, the history of comparative nationalism. And so I just wanted to ask you a little bit about how and why you became interested in the topic of nationalism and comparative nationalism.
I mean, I think part of it has to do with family history, honestly. Growing up in a house of sort of Polish Jews who had grown up in Palestine/Israel and transferred to the United States in the 1950s. I was born in the U.S., but very much in this sort of cultural cocoon, where we were preoccupied with questions of identity and Zionism and Arab-Israeli politics. So these questions of the relationship between heritage, identity, political legitimacy, statehood were sort of intellectual food that I was raised on, and in that sense, I suppose I was always preoccupied with these kinds of issues before I even started to consider them from an academic or scholarly point of view, and then my interest in nationalism academically grew partly out of my dissertation and first book, which looked at Anglo-French imperial rivalry in Syria and Lebanon during the Second World War, where the politics of competitive imperialisms sort of converged and clashed with the politics of local nationalism in the Middle East, and that, I think, led to my thinking about those academic topics in broader and more comparative and global contexts.
Interesting. And so, with the endurance of nationalism, you bring up several different themes, and you talk of this tension. Could you talk a little bit about, I guess, how your thoughts and understanding of nationalism changed over time, and how it sort of led you to the ideas and really the arguments that you make in The Endurance of Nationalism?
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose, one element of the argument that you're alluding to has to do with the relationship between tradition and modernity, nostalgia for a mythological golden age on the one hand, and embrace of political, economic, and cultural modernity on the other hand, that's typical of many modern nationalisms, and the insight that these elements are in tension with one another in nationalism is not original to me, but it struck me that perhaps rather than viewing this as merely an anomaly or a contradiction in terms, perhaps it also speaks to one of the strengths of nationalism as a mobilizing force and as a legitimizing force in the modern era, insofar as it is precisely its combination of kind of romanticization of a nationalized past with its promise of bringing legitimacy and progress to a people in the modern era that holds the key to its appeal and to its endurance.
Mm. That's fascinating. And you really take take to task some previous theories on nationalism, in particular Benedict Anderson on some of his perspectives. Did you want to maybe comment a little bit on how that conversation unfolded in your book?
Yeah, I think it's still the case that the predominant schools of thought among theorists of nationalism in particular tend to view nationalism as a byproduct and perhaps a central element of the modern era, and it certainly is a central element of the modern era. But there's been a tendency among some of the canonical theoretical works on nationalism, ranging from Benedict Anderson's work to that of Ernest Gellner and others. There's been a tendency to see it as exclusively modern in its origins and in the nature of the way it functions in the political world. And I suppose that at some gut level, I always found that difficult to believe, but of course one's own gut is not a very good guide to academic analysis. But it also struck me as, in some ways, an almost ahistorical approach to nationalism. And Benedict Anderson was a historian, as was E.J. Hobsbawm, but others such as Gellner, who have come to the topic have not been historians. And it's to suggest that the strong belief in the identity of a popular community as the basis for legitimate rule is an exclusively modern concept that somehow springs up as a byproduct of structural, economic, and geopolitical factors, and that nonetheless exerts a powerful emotional grip on popular sentiment. That just didn't make sense to me. All of these theories fail to explain the source of the emotional appeal of nationalism. They ultimately either sought to rationalize it as an important sort of aspect of economic and political modernization, or to portray it as a part of a reactionary backlash against modernity and global integration, and thus is something profoundly irrational. But in either case, these theories, it seemed to me, failed to successfully explain or grapple with the sheer emotional appeal that nationalism can have in the modern age. And so this led me to think that it appeals to something emotional, almost instinctive, that dare I say primordial, that it cannot be viewed exclusively as a sort of epiphenomenon of modernity. So hence my attempt to examine the what I see as pre-modern manifestations of nationalism, while at the same time I don't think that has to lead to a reductionism of a nationalist sort. I mean, it's one of the pitfalls of nationalist ideology that it tends to portray the nation as having always existed somehow in fixed form through time, and the nation only needs to be awakened to its true self in order to realize its full potential. That's obviously not the kind of mythologizing and chauvinism that I'm trying to advocate for, but I think one can, it makes sense to look at pre-modern antecedents of modern emotions in order to make sense of them, and emotions, psychology, and senses of group solidarity are phenomena that that can hardly be considered confined to the modern age. Absolutely,
and I really felt that your discussion of both Jewish history and tradition, or Greece, and even to some degree I mentioned in my own studies of China, there are clearly examples that go well before the modern era that seem to point to earlier forms of a sense of nationness or nationalism, if you will, that aren't necessarily connected to the modern nation state.
Right. And that said, that begs the question of how does modernity challenge and transform expressions of nationalism? So I think that sort of, asserting that nationalism may well have existed prior to modernity is not the same as to say that national identity is or can be unchanging through time. Quite the contrary.
And maybe incorrectly, but I got the sense from your reading that this at a certain point, if exactly precisely when nationalism becomes maybe brittle or as much as it changes over time, as it becomes more fixed, it also kind of perhaps loses its endurance, if you will, to a degree. It's precisely the ability to appropriate and both pull back from an ancient past, an antiquity, if you will, and yet and sort of draw from that, appropriate that, and use it for a contemporary sense.
It's a fine balance, right? And if nationalism sort of becomes so fixated on integrating into a global modernity that it loses touch with any sense of tradition or continuity with the past, it can rapidly alienate a large sector of the population. And by the same token, if it turns into sort of hyper-nostalgic mode and becomes fixated on making fill-in-the-blank great again, based on a kind of
fixed interpretation.
Yeah,
of
fixed interpretation of an idealized moment in past time. Then obviously it can overreach in the backwards direction as well.
That's really fascinating to me too, because I think as you raised, taking nationalism, at least the study of nationalism outside of the modern era, really allows you to sort of broaden the aperture or the range of questions you can ask,
right.
and from a comparative perspective as well, the different types of comparisons you can make then thereof, which kind of leads me to my next question then. So since the Endurance of Nationalism was published in 2006, have your ideas of about the study of nationalism changed since then, and if so, how?
I would say two things. One is that it seems to me that some recent developments or trends in historiography, have maybe sort of indirectly validated my approach. I'm thinking in particular of some recent work that questions the whole concept of modernity, and personally I wouldn't go that far. I don't like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but it's useful to look at to acknowledge the limitations of paradigms without necessarily discarding them, and some of this recent literature has emphasized the need to look at sort of the longue durée of history, reaching far back before modernity, in order to understand the dynamics of social and political development through modernity. So looking at earlier layers of human development and cultural infrastructure, and how it both shapes and is transformed by historical developments of the last 200 years, rather than drawing a sharp line at the French Revolution or some other arbitrarily drawn moment, and treating everything that comes afterwards as though it had been built on a kind of blank slate. And so in that respect, I think that there are some trends in the field in history as a whole that lend support to the search for continuities across the modern, pre-modern divide in any number of different fields, of which nationalism can and should be one. The other direction in which it's developed, I think, just at the moment, it's hard to be terribly optimistic about the trajectory of nationalism. I think in some of my writings I've sort of, tended to voiced support for theorists who have argued that liberalism can and ought to be reconciled with nationalism, that nationalism needn't be inherently or exclusively chauvinistic and xenophobic, that having a sense of national community is in fact an important foundation for political legitimacy in any kind of state, including perhaps particularly in a liberal democratic state where sovereignty is held to rest with the people, which begs the question of what identity then holds the people together in a unitary body politic. So I do still think that without some form of national identity, be it ethnic or civic or some combination of the two in practice, it's very difficult to hold a democratic society together. But clearly we're living in the midst of a right-wing nationalist and populist backlash in this country as in many other parts of the world, and so it's a moment at which the belief in the possibility of a liberal nationalist synthesis is harder to sustain than I hope will be the case a few years from now.
And I mean that's kind of interesting, because in some ways I think about it as almost an intention, a certain degree of tension between nationalism and globalism, or so-called globalization, in so much as a nationalist backlash against perhaps getting lost in this sort of nebulous global community, if you will.
Yeah, quite so, in which the perception is that sovereignty is being taken away from the nation state and transferred to faceless, globalist, technocratic institutions or conspiracies or inflows of refugees who are taking things away from us, the nation, and this combination of experiences and perceptions and fears is clearly having some negative repercussions.
And certainly creating some anxiety across the globe.
Quite so.
So what can you tell us on, what are you working on now?
My current project looks at comparative political responses to German and Japanese occupation in Europe, in various case studies in Europe and East Asia, Southeast Asia during the Second World War. And so once again I sort of returned to the theme of empires, in this case the Axis empires or would-be empires, and national identities. But I'm also interested in such themes as in a variety of political responses to occupation, including internationalist responses, and how they either complemented or clashed with nationalist and patriotic conceptions of duty in the face of enemy occupation.
Wow. Well, that's about all that we have time for tonight, but I wanted to thank you for joining us for this interview, and I wanted to thank you as well to the audience for sticking with us and hearing what Professor Roshwald had to say.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it very much.
Likewise.
Thank you.